So our presentation tonight is by Dr. Lori Lee. She's a Keenan Distinguished Associate Professor of Anthropology at Flagler College. Her research examines the materiality of migration, health practices, and identity among African diaspora populations. And we're very excited to have you here tonight. So thank you for being here, and I'll stop sharing and let you take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Let me get this going. Try. There we go. All right. Can you see it? Can you see it now?
Yes, you're good to go.
Okay, good. Thank you. Okay, so I am excited to talk to you all about the work we're doing at Fort Mose. Again, thank you all for coming on this weeknight. I really appreciate everyone for showing up and for you having me out. I apologize in advance for my cat, who's rather obnoxious and right here, so I'll try to keep him under control. But as we get started, let's see. I wanted to be sure and make it clear to you that this project is a collaborative project. My own work is largely community-based participatory research, and this particular project is one that I do in collaboration with James Davidson at University of Florida and Liz Ibarola, who is at University of Texas at Austin. So I will be mostly saying we here, so that I just want you to be mindful of the fact that I'm talking about the work of all three of us as I go through this presentation. So this is a project that we started in 2019, and I'll talk to you a little bit about the development of that and what it builds upon as we're moving along. But in addition to it being a collaborative project between the three of us, it is, as I said, a very community-based project. So we have lots of other research partners as well. And I want to be sure that you're aware of those. We partner with the Fort Mose Historical Society, who you see pictured in the upper left, and Thomas Jackson speaking to some of our students on the bottom left there. We wouldn't be able to do this project quite literally without our partnership with the Lighthouse Archaeological Maritime Program, who we are required to go to the site by boat. And we couldn't get to the site without them. And additionally, our partnership with Florida Public Archaeological Network is invaluable to us. So they've been helpful in so many ways. And you can see that our work certainly builds upon, in so many ways, the work of Kathy Deegan and her students at this site, and Carl Halbert and Andrea White and the city archaeologists, again, because community expands beyond the immediate site of Fort Mose, which we'll be talking about. Additionally, part of what we're researching here in terms of understanding the impacts of colonialism and how people attempted to forge freedom in a contested landscape is the legacy of some of the land management practices that we see here. So certainly the way that the site exists now, and I'll show you some images of that, it exists on what are three islands. The fort that we'll be talking about primarily, the second fort, Fort Mose II, which was occupied from 1752 to 1763. Is on one particular island, and it has been impacted by erosion that's accelerated by climate change, boat wave action, as well as some historic dredging activities, which I'll talk about more. So that image on the left is showing you where some trees have fallen down and are disturbing the site which still has archaeological integrity. You can see some creamware eroding out of that there in that image. But again, to get to what you're here to actually hear about is Fort Mose, the site of Fort Mose. If you're not familiar with it, this is a very unique and important site in the history of Florida, North America, and the world. It is a World Heritage Site, thanks to the hard efforts of Dr. Kathleen Deegan and Dr. Jane Landers, and all that they did and to put forward the site to make it part of the UNESCO World Heritage sites of the root of slavery and slave memory. So This is a 1783 map that shows you the relationship between the town of St. Augustine and the Castillo de San Marcos and the Fort Mose, Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose, which you see there circled in red, which is 2 miles north of the city itself. So it has a very strategic location here. Was placed here specifically so it would be the first line of defense against the British who were coming from the Carolinas. It's also important that you know, again, that we are not the first archaeologists to work out here. The presence of Fort Mose at its current location, it was identified and confirmed by Charles Fairbanks in 1971, and he went out there with Kathy Deegan, and she worked with members of the Black Caucus to raise funds to begin investigating the site archaeologically. They were made aware of the site by the landowner, Jack Williams, who was a member at the time of the St. Augustine Historical Society. And he became interested in the site because he was very interested in the Patriot War. And he felt like he could find evidence of the Patriots War at the site, and then realized that that was probably the location of Fort Mose. So Fairbanks went out in 1971, started doing shovel tests, and then Kathy was able to raise funding to go back out and do archaeological excavations in there in 1987 to 88 that confirmed that this was in fact the location of the fort. And I'll talk about the context, the socio-political context of her work a little bit later. So what you're looking at here is the original Fort Mose. There were 2. The first Fort Mose was built in 1738 and was occupied until 1740, when Oglethorpe came in and raided from the north, and it was destroyed in 1740 by British forces during the War of Jenkins' Ear. At that time, the people who lived and worked at Fort Mose, and in 1759 there was a census, and there were 59 people living out there in 22 houses. So those folks then moved into town, into St. Augustine, and were working as in the militia there, and as well as doing service jobs. They brought with them their wives, some of whom came with them through self-emancipation from South Carolina. Some were married to enslaved people who lived in the city, and I think it's very important that people understand that though Fort Mose is very unique in that it is the first free Black settlement in Spanish North America. At the same time that it existed, there was still slavery among the Spanish in neighboring St. Augustine. So there were people intermarried between Fort Mose and the enslaved community in St. Augustine, and some folks were married to indigenous women as well. So it was a very multicultural community, and for that reason, we were really interested in going back out there to explore and find out what more we could reveal about what lives were like of the people who lived at this fascinating place, because this is such an important part of, as I said, local, national, and global history. So we decided to go back out in 2019, and that was our first field season there. So I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so as I said, the site is itself on an island, which you can see here. You're looking sort of northeast here, where that area is circled in red, and the site borders Robinson Creek. So that's the body of water that you see there. And it always, that waterway of Robinson Creek was the eastern wall of the fort. So Fort Mose II only had 3 walls, and I'll show you a drawing of it in a moment. But that was so that the waterway could be used to get people in and out and for transport. And then the defense was around the other 3 sides. So Again, the location of it on this waterway is important historically and for transportation, but it's also critically important for you to understand why the site is being so heavily impacted by erosion and climate change. So we feel that it's really important to get out there and get as much evidence as we can before the site is completely inundated by climate change. So here's a drawing, as I said, of that second fort. It's a hypothetical reconstruction made by Albert Manussi based on period sources. And so the waterway that you see the bottom of that image is Robinson Creek. And I want you to note that in this image that on the western side of the fort, there are agricultural fields next to the fort. And this we know based on historic documents that tell us what this area looked like, how many settlements there were. It's not clear how many houses were inside the fort and how many were outside. And that's part of what we're investigating archaeologically. But we know that we have evidence of domestic structures inside the fort, and historic documents tell us that also within the fort was a home for a Franciscan priest, as well as a watchtower. So you see those in this depiction. And then next to the wall of the fort, which was earthen, there was a moat that was planted with Spanish bayonet. So again, using local plants as a form of defense, which is really interesting. But I want you to note those agricultural fields because those no longer exist, and I'll talk to you about why that is. In the picture on the bottom left, you see a line coming off what is the southwest corner of the fort, and that is the Fort Mose line. That was a line of defense. So again, this was set up as a settlement. So we have this fort here, and I've not really explained why that is. The Spanish recognized that they needed additional help with defending their city. So, and particularly they wanted people who were willing to be on the frontier between South Carolina and Georgia and what became Georgia and the town. So in 1693, the Spanish government said, well, if enslaved people want to seek refuge in Florida, they can do so, and we will grant them freedom if they will do two things. First of all, we want them to convert to Catholicism. And secondly, we want them to serve in the military and fight against the British. Well, you probably couldn't find a better group of people to fight against the British than people who were formerly enslaved by them. So in fact, you have people who begin escaping, self-emancipating, running south. And again, that road from the Underground Railroad runs south into St. Augustine. And ultimately, Governor Montiano establishes this fort here, the first fort in 1738, for this purpose, for people to live and fight in this location. So here we are. This is our 2019 field school getting ready to go out to the site. And I'll talk more about that process in a moment, but they are standing. Fort Mose 2 is located on the South Island. What you're looking at in this image is in front of them is the North Island. So they're getting ready to walk out. We are getting ready to walk out to the site in that way. So what are we finding? What kinds of evidence are we finding out there that tells us about the fort and its occupation? So again, our work builds on the work of Kathy Deegan and her students at the site, and it was in the time frame they were working, it became important to prove that the remains of the archaeological remains that they were finding were Fort Mose, because in the socio-political climate that they were working in the 1980s, there were a number of people in this community who didn't want to accept that. They didn't want to believe that that was located there. And they did that by putting in a series of excavation units, again, building upon Charles Fairbanks' shovel test survey out at the site, where they were finding concentrations of domestic artifacts and looking at some remnant earth works. There's not a lot left, but there is some, and they were able to predict where part of the moat might be. So they did end up encountering part of the moat in their excavations, and were able to demonstrate based on that and the other units. And I'll show you a map of that in a second, what that this was in fact Fort Mose too. So when we're doing excavation out there and you're looking down into a unit about 40 centimeters down here, what we're looking for in terms of what does that look like in the ground? There is a shell lens that dates to the first Spanish period, so 1565 to 1763. And again, that's 1752 to 1763 period we're particularly interested in at the site. We do, of course, look at what happened at the site most recently, and we're interested in that as well into the present. So I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the modern uses of the site, but also what was happening prehistorically. The site is built right on top of shell middens. So we're looking at those aspects of the site as well. But for our particular research interest, we're most interested in the Fort Mose II occupation period. So when we get to this shell lens, we know that we're getting very close to that. So here we've gone through that, and you can see what that looks like in profile. And critically important to us, of course, are any features that can tell us about structures that existed at the site. So you can see the shell lens in profile, what it looks like, and what our subsoil looks like, and one of the features that we encountered here. Here's the map that I've been promising you of the site. And this map shows you outline of the fort based on the excavations. So if you can see the north arrow in the bottom, and if you look up at the north part of the map and at that north wall, that long trench that you see there, that is actually the excavation unit that contained the moat. So that's how we know where that location of that particular line of the fort was. And then you can see the south line was also captured. You can also very clearly see that the outlines of the fort are not all contained on what is the North Island. So it is on the South Island. So on the southwest corner of the site is completely covered by water. So part of what we've been doing with our partnership with LAMP is investigating that. Looking at the impacts of erosion to the site. So in the excavation units that you can see, the large blocks that are open, those were the units that Kathy and her team excavated. You can see the smaller units with numbers in them. Those were our 2019 and 2021 excavation units. So we've got those mapped in there, and based on this evidence, we're starting to get patterns that we can tell what some of our structures were. So we're very excited about it. It is a slow process, and I'll talk to you about why that is as well. But hopefully you can see some of this. But if you're looking at the map and you're looking to the southwest, where you've got that big square going into the water, and you can see the southwestmost unit with the number in it. We have a whole cluster of units in that area that are currently being lost to sea level rise. I don't have all of the 2022 units in here yet. We did go back out, but with LAMP, what we were doing is they were putting some units in the area of the fort that is now inundated with water. And one of the really interesting things to us is that the stratigraphy that we were finding at the edge of the land at the site seems to be very similar still with what they're finding underwater. It looks like some of that stratigraphy is in fact still intact. So we're pretty excited about that. And we're in the process of doing the analysis to see if that holds true now that we have the material out of the water. But that's pretty exciting. We didn't anticipate that. We thought we would have reverse stratigraphy or a lot of loss, but it looks like there may be some integrity there, which is very hopeful for Fort Mose I if it does still exist in the water, it may have some pretty good site integrity. So that's another thing that LAMP is interested in looking at. So I said, yeah, there is more recent history for Mose that we find when we're doing archaeology out there. So in 2019, we put in an excavation unit close to Robinson Creek, which is the eastern edge of the site, because we know that there was a historic marker on the site, and we wanted, so it seemed logical to us, based on where the Park Service has put signage on the island, that if there were a marker, it might be in that area. So we wanted to test and see if we could find that. And that's the unit they're working in here. But what we actually found was we did find some interesting historic materials and prehistoric materials, including a historic axe head. But the preponderance of those finds were dominated by 1970s campfire trash. So we get a sense of how people have used the site more recently. We know through oral histories, which we're also conducting at the site, of stakeholders, that people have been going out there for decades to camp, including Jack Williams, who, as I said, owned the property before the state bought it from him. And that picture on the top left is Jack Williams and his family. And they're sitting at just about this spot where this unit is, actually, because the tree that's behind them, you see, has a weird cut out shape in it that people could place things into. It's very distinctive, and it is still there. So we know exactly where they were. In addition to the excavation unit that you see here that Simon's standing on top of, we did place in, we were, when we were looking for Kathy's datums, we brought out a metal detector, and there was one location that's just west of where the the person closest to you in the picture on the top right is sitting. And we put in, there was a very strong metal detector hit there. We put in a shovel test there to see if that was where one of the datums was, because based on our maps, there should have been one in that general region. What we found instead was a lot of trash that we think we can tie directly to Jack Williams and his family based on some oral histories there. Oh, the other thing that you see there, the handwriting on the bottom, is you see these quotes, the secret island. So we do go out periodically and check on the site, knowing that people use the site. And just recently, about a month ago, the state park put some no trespassing signs on the site, and we're very happy and thankful for that. But campers came out to the site and left a Rubbermaid container with camping supplies in it and a journal, so that anybody who came out could continue to use those things. And it has this journal in it about the secret island, that we love this spot and tell us what you're doing out here. So we recovered that as well. Okay, but again, this was a military site. So in terms of contested freedoms and practices of freedom, being willing to fight and engage in military service was important there. And we find lots of evidence of that at the site. Many types of gun flints and shirt, and you can see as well lead shot, including Rupert shot. And you can see here is an additional image, musket balls, as well as lead shot. We also found these interesting lead gunflint clamps from muskets. Really interesting to us, particularly are the ones that you see on the right, the one that's on the right, which is pictured twice. But because it has teeth marks in it, because we know that lead is really soft and tastes sweet, unfortunately. But so sometimes people would chew on it. And we are interested very much in identity and how people in freedom chose to express their sense of identity. So we're very excited about the types of personal adornment we're finding at the site. So buttons are one of those. We find a lot of fairly simple metal buttons. We have a few bone and some shell ones as well. We find evidence of brass shoe buckles, brass hooks, again, indicating things we would expect to find from that time frame, and telling us about clothing. And in the time frame when Fort Mose II was occupied, women's clothing is less likely to have buttons, more likely to be used closed with hook and eye fasteners. And so we're interested in sort of the gendered expressions of identity as well. Certainly because Davidson and I both have a very strong interest in glass beads and what these mean. We were very excited to find a number of glass beads at the site of various types, wound, drawn, faceted. And those are, intriguingly though, our site itself is fairly small in size, as you saw from the map, we're still finding patterns in discrete areas in the site. So most of our items of personal adornment come from the northern section of the site to date, whereas we have some interesting patterns with indigenous occupation toward the southern end of the site. Probably one of my favorite objects, well, maybe my favorite object, again, given my interest in health and well-being, is this Robert Turlington's Balsam of Life bottle. So I'm really interested in this for a number of reasons. This is the very first patent bottle, right? The Robert Turlington's Balsam of Life bottle, not this particular version, but it is the earliest. So people would patent the bottles so that they didn't have to patent the contents, so they wouldn't have to tell people what was inside of them. They didn't want to reveal the ingredients. And so you would get these really interesting shaped bottles that are embossed. So it's an early example of an embossed bottle. And you can see in the drawing on the right that balsam is spelled B-A-L-S-A-M. In the bottle that we have, it is B-A-L-S-O-M, which was made for the North American market, and it was patented in 1754. So the time frame, the chronology of it is interesting, and also because the folks who lived and worked at Fort Mose were willing to do so in exchange for their freedom. But after the War of Jenkins' Ear happened, they were more reluctant to go back out to the site. They'd been living in town for 12 years and they didn't want to go back out. Governor Montiano had been replaced and the new governor was very insistent that they go back out, and he actually had one man whipped. So again, it is contested freedoms in some way, because he insisted that they didn't want to go back out because they wanted their full freedom, but they are, again, supposed to be fully free. And the reasons why they didn't want to go back out there were not because they didn't want their freedom. In the documents we have that say why they didn't want to go back out, they were fear of being attacked again, but even more so, it's because they had a better quality of life in town. They complained a lot about the living conditions and the impact on their health and well-being. So that is also why I'm particularly interested in this bottle and another medicinal vial that we found at the site last year. So I'm interested in that. What are people doing when they have the ability to treat their health and well-being in the ways that they're interested in? And another reason why I'm interested in the glass beads. How are they doing that? So that's another example. So here's a view of the site from Fort Mose Creek. So I just wanted you to get a sense of what that looks like as you're approaching it, and to sort of see the size of it, the scale of it, and also just how close to being inundated it is, right? So it's not very high above sea level. With the king tides, a significant portion of that island is and can be underwater. So it's estimated that within the next 100 years, it will be completely underwater. So we feel it's imperative to do this excavation and get this material out while we can. This site is not accessible to people by foot. You can get there by foot, and we did initially do so, but it's not easily accessible to people by foot because it is surrounded by water. And people are not supposed to walk out there because it impacts the salt marshes. So the state park is, of course, protecting the natural resources as well as the cultural resources. And so they don't want people trudging through the salt marshes, but you can still access the site by boat. And that was a problem for us in terms of protecting the cultural resources, because people would just come out there anytime they felt like it. So again, we're very excited about the no trespassing signs that they've just put up on that western edge of the site. So hopefully that will help protect it in many ways. So originally, the first year, as I said, we did walk out to the site, and this map shows you where the Fort Mose Historical Society is. And let me just put in a plug for them. At 10:30 on Saturday, from 10:30 to 11:30, they're going to have an event about the history of Fort Mose out at the site, if you can make it. If you want details, I'm happy to share those. But we were allowed to, for the very first year, to walk out along the edge of the northern island to reach the southern island. The scar that you see that goes from the boardwalk area out to the site, that is the path that Kathy and her team took out to the site. And they didn't want us to keep walking on that because they want that salt marsh to grow back in. But remember, I told you that that salt marsh used to be agricultural fields. And the reason it's not agricultural fields anymore is because it was dredged in the late 19th century. And I'll tell you who did that and why in a moment. And here's Jack Williams out at the site. And then again, I'll just skip these. I was going to tell you about the connections between, but I feel like I'm going way over time. So I was going to tell you about some of the connections between Flagler College, where I work, and Fort Mose, and between the community, because again, it's not just the site, but it's the whole community and the ties between these spaces that is important. But you do need to see this map. So Markland House that you see in this picture, this 1885 map, this is before Flagler College was built, and Flagler College is named after Henry Flagler, who bought this land from Dr. Anderson, who lived in Markland House. And Markland House was built in 1839, and it was on land that had extant orange groves, but it was not originally a plantation house. Those orange groves were part of former plantations. Yahala, which city archaeologists are excavating right now, another really exciting project that you should look into, and invite them out to come talk about. And Buena Esperanza, which is just across the street. Both of those are just across the street in that neighborhood, those two plantations. And those plantations over time, after emancipation, some recently emancipated people came into that area just across from where Markland House is located, and they purchased the land and named it Little Africa, and they started an African American community there. And then by the late 1880s, 1890s, that area is known as Lincolnville, and is still known as Lincolnville today. So there are many ties between this area and just 2 miles north where Fort Mose is. But Anderson, when there was in 1885, there was a blight of oranges. He convinced his friend, Henry Flagler, to buy his groves in the area that you see where that arrow is. And so that land included what you see here labeled as Maria Sanchez Creek. So there were a lot of there was salt marshy area, and Flagler's best known as an industrial railroad magnate, but he was also a developer. So he wanted to develop that land and grow St. Augustine. And in order to do that, he needed to do something about the salt marshes that were continually flooded by Maria Sanchez Creek that you see there. And the thing that he chose to do was to buy land north of the city, dredge that land, and fill in the area that was prone to flooding. That area happens to be where Flagler College is today. So he impacted that by historically dredging it. And we think that's what happened to the agricultural fields and why that area is salt marsh today, and why the southwest corner of the fort is now missing and underwater. So again, here's some historic image, and there's the Yalaha and Esperanza plantations that you can see there, Lincolnville, just some things I was talking about really quickly. That's the land that became the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which became Flagler College. And this is a 1943 map that shows some of that dredging that took place and how devastating it was to the landscape out there. Fortunately, it missed most of Fort Mose too, and it's not known if it was because of the elevation or because there was any historical memory of that site actually existing there. But you can see that there. Oops. So again, these are just some redundant images, but to show you, these are some of the many field school students who came out and helped us and made this a really exciting research project. A number of them have gone on to do some of their own papers and present some of their own first academic research at conferences related to their work here and continued on into graduate school. And we're also very proud of the activism and the engagement with the community that they do here. So you see one of our students here standing at the edge of Flagler College. The street that was filled in particularly is the street that is between Ponce de Leon Hotel, Flagler College, and the Lightner Museum, what is now the Lightner Museum, and Lincolnville. And they're standing right here during the Black Lives Matter protest, fighting for the rights of people in the street. So again, we're really interested in this project as a way to develop community ties, creating sense of community with all of our students from various institutions. And we've gotten a grant for 2 years that is meant to help diversify the field as well, and make field school accessible for students who wouldn't otherwise maybe be able to access it. So that's another exciting component of our project that we're very proud of. So that's a really quick overview of some of the work we've been doing. And oops, I will stop talking and see if you all have any questions. I don't know what I need to do. Oops.
Well, thank you so much for presenting your research. It's awesome on a World Heritage Site, such an important place right here in Florida. So we're going to open it up. If anyone had any questions, go ahead. You can type them in the chat. I think that's usually easiest.
Thank you. I think you could see me like pointing at the screen. Sorry about that. I just realized because I couldn't see my picture the whole time. I'm old, sorry.
No, it's quite all right. You did great. And I like the contributions by your cat.
Yeah, Drifter is nothing if not supportive.
All right. Looks like we have a question from Rachel. Great talk. Does the fact that you probably have intact stratigraphy in the now submerged areas of the site change your view of how threatened the site is? And does this change the feeling of urgency at the site?
It does not, and here's why. That I did not expand upon that, and thank you for giving me that opportunity. It seems that we have intact stratigraphy right in that southwest corner, but only a couple of our units were placed there. The underwater units were also placed outside of where that former corner was, and those areas are not intact. So there's a lot that we still have to do surrounding the fort. And then the ones that we put on the eastern side, there have shown some, there are some differences between the different areas that we were testing. So, and then in terms of your question about, does it change my thoughts about urgency, even though there is some intact stratigraphy in that southwest section, or it seems, again, we still have to do that analysis. This was based on visual understanding of what they were seeing under the water compared to what we were finding. But we still think it's critically urgent because the cost of doing the underwater archaeology is so much more expensive than doing it while it's still terrestrial. So, and to mitigate any harm to that. So in addition to doing the underwater units, we have done units on the slope. So those wet site components are significantly impacted, the ones that are on the slopes, by the water coming in. And so it seems like the dredging event, perhaps, because it was so sudden and the land was taken out, filled the water up pretty quickly, but the erosional ones are impacting the site in a different way. So for a number of reasons, my answer would be that no, we still think that the impacts are significant and that the urgency is still high. Thanks.
Thanks. Great question. Kathleen would like to know, she said, thank you for a very interesting talk. And could you describe a little bit more about the location, like how close it is to downtown St. Augustine?
Yes. Hi, Kathleen. Thanks for coming. Kathleen and I had fellowships together this summer. So how close it is. So it's literally 2 miles north of the city gates. So it's very close to downtown St. Augustine, and an integral part. So at that time, it was sort of on the frontier, and what existed between where Fort Mose was placed and into the city was it was a site of indigenous occupation. So Nombre de Dios, you may be familiar with as well from Kathy Deegan's work and Gifford Waters and others. That was between Fort Mose and the town itself. So it's a really interesting, and if you're interested in any maps, I'd be happy to share some maps with you, but it's very close to downtown St. Augustine. You can see the Castillo from there, and you can see if you've been to St. Augustine at all in the last 50 years, literally they, for the 400th anniversary, they erected this enormous cross at Nombre de Dios, and you can see it very clearly from our site, and then the Castillo is just further down from that. So, yeah.
All right, thanks. The next question by Lewis, he was interested was it always named Fort Mose, or did the name change? Did the Spanish call it something different?
They did. They called it Gracia Real de Santa Teresa de Mose. So de Mose was named after the Mose Creek, is what they called the creek at that point. And Santa Teresa was the patron saint of the town, Teresa de Avila in Spain. So that is what they called it. And then over time, it became locally known as Fort Mose, or some people called it Fort Mosa or Mose. Okay.
Rolls off the tongue a little bit easier.
It does, yeah, yeah.
Okay. Don would like to know if you found any evidence of a dock or landing at the site.
I wish. And I wish only because if it was there, we could argue that we should sort of rebuild that historically, the dock and the landing. But no, again, the island is fairly accessible all along that eastern side. So they just left that open and people would just come right up in their boats from the eastern side. We don't have any evidence of a dock. We do have evidence of docks and landings in St. Augustine at other sites, but not this one. And it may be the case that the dredging eliminated one if there was.
Robert would like to know if the dig is currently ongoing and if there are any volunteer opportunities.
So the site is, there is still another field season that will be happening, at least one more field season. The issue with volunteering is complicated, and here's why: because we can only access the site by boat. And so it is usually just restricted to the people in the field school and the interns that we have. However, we have lots of volunteer opportunities for you if you're interested in this location and time period through a GTM NER grant that we have, and by we, I mean with Florida Public Archaeology Network, where we're doing some testing to understand more about the people who lived at Guana Plantation. So again, expanding on what we know about African diaspora and indigenous peoples in this region. So that project is ongoing, and we certainly have volunteer opportunities for that. If you're interested, you can email me, L-Lee, L-L-E-E, at flagler.edu.
Awesome. Go ahead and, if anyone else has any questions, go ahead and type them. I will ask a question real quick for you. I'm a big shell nerd, and I saw your shell lens that dates to the first Spanish period. I was wondering if you could discuss a little bit about the species composition there, and if it's different at Fort Mose than potentially some of the stuff closer to Castillo, or if they were eating shellfish at all and just more strictly agriculture and other things.
They are eating shellfish at the site. So in terms of your interest, if you're particularly interested in that, I can send you the faunal report that I have, so you can find out more detailed. I think you probably want more detailed than that. But one of the things that's interesting, because again, food waste, what are we seeing in terms of, are there differences that are an expression of freedom in some way, or are there not? Or are those constraints based on environment? And we're in the process of teasing that out. So in terms of the species that are being consumed, there are a lot more shellfish and marine species at Fort Mose than there are in the town, which is very, very close. So yeah, we have a lot of oyster. A lot. We have shark, we have snake, we have a wide variety of things, which again indicate, because there's such a wide variety of things being consumed, and very little wild, very little domesticated, like cattle and pig. We don't have a lot of that. But in terms of the variety of shells, mostly oyster, but there are other species, and I can send that report to you if you're interested. And my new colleague who started this semester, Jessie Jenkins, is also very fascinated with shells. And so she's going to investigate that in more detail for us as well. So I should have some really exciting stuff coming out about that, or she might, not me, soon. So.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to see the report, and it's great that Jessica is at Flagler now, and I'm sure that collaboration will yield a lot of important insights into the site. Yeah, she's an oyster genius.
We're very excited about it. Yeah. So.
Yeah. The next question is from Charles, and he would like to know what the Patriot War is.
The Patriot War of 1812. So it was in 1812. Patriot War is when the British, it was about loyalty to the British and coming in and taking over the land there. There are more details than that. I'm a little foggy on it at the moment, but I can get back to you on that. Again, my interest is a little bit sooner than that, but we do have a colleague who's doing the British period. We have a significant, we have a British component to the site, the post 1763. The thing that I didn't say is in 1763, at the end of the first Spanish period, all the folks who lived at Fort Mose, as well as all the remaining indigenous people, left for the Spanish and went to Cuba. At what happens to Fort Mose after that is that it becomes, so that is the beginning of the British period. And Governor Grant, who owns the land at GTM NER, owns some of the property near there. And there are plantations established in that same area. And there is suggestion, though we don't yet have proof, that though Fort Mose was deteriorating, that the people who owned the land housed enslaved people in the same buildings where free people were living at Fort Mose. So we're looking for evidence of that. So it's the shifting between the British and the Spanish. the French, then the Spanish, then the British, then the Spanish, then the Americans. That is all encapsulated there. And the Patriots War is part of that colonial history that, again, I don't know as much about as I probably should, but yeah.
Thank you. And then there's another question about the wall of Fort Mose. It was earthen, right? Is that what?
Yeah, they were earthen walls. And then you see this in other locations too. I've seen it in the Caribbean where they will use earthworks and then they will plant them with defensive plants. So Spanish bayonet is, if you're not familiar, it's very sharp. It's a plant that has long blade-like stems, and that's why it's called a bayonet, and they're very sharp. So planted with that makes it hard for people to get through. It's a deterrent. And there's also quite a bit of prickly pear too, which was used to fill the moats. And we still have extant prickly pear at the site. There's one area of the site that we have planned to do some work in from the very beginning, but we have never gotten there. And it's an area that has a high concentration of prickly pear. We just haven't, because of the requirement to use boats, we don't have as many contact hours on the site as we initially anticipated, and that's why we haven't been able to do that component yet.
I just worked at a site a few months ago with a lot of Spanish bayonet. It is not a fun plant to get poked by.
It's really not. It's really, really not. And if you don't know what it is and you run into some, then you'll go, oh, that must be Spanish bayonet.
The name is very accurate, right?
It's very accurate, yeah. So it sounds maybe far-fetched that you could use a plant defensively, but it's actually not. In the Caribbean, they would plant defensive plants along the edges of plantations to keep people, the idea was they were trying to keep people from escaping. So they could, it would be difficult or a deterrent for them to get out.
Absolutely. All right, so we'll just ask one more question for you. This one was kind of long, so I'm gonna try to ask it a little more succinctly. There's a theory that people at the Spanish colony at what is now Charleston, South Carolina, was attacked by the British from potentially Jamestown in 1613. Is there any record or evidence of the Spanish colonists arriving in St. Augustine? And has anyone speculated that the attack at Charleston was revenge because they believed the nearby Spanish had attacked Roanoke Island?
I do not know. I don't know that answer to that. I don't know. But if you want to send me an email, I will find out for you. So yeah. Who needs the answer to that question?
William Jenkins asked it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to find out more about that. There's certainly significant ties to South Carolina in here, which we could do a whole nother hour on, but I am not familiar with that, so I'm not sure.
All righty. Well, thanks again. It was great.
Thank you.
Great
I
questions, everyone, too. Yeah, we had a great time. There's comments and compliments going off in the chat, so be sure to read those before you leave. But thanks again, everyone.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next month.
Bye.